That's working. Hi. So, what I'm going to do today is give you an overview and introduction to the class. Um, it is kind of patently absurd. Let's go ahead and start there. That in 5 weeks, we can really do justice to the topic that our course title expects us to do: people and cultures of Africa. What even does that mean? I think I've mentioned before, or I will mention in another video, that you'll see that there's over 2,000 ethnic groups in Africa. And there's just literally no way for us to do justice to 2,000 cultures and the history of those cultures and the unique experiences of people who come from those cultures in 5 weeks. So silly. And, we couldn't do it in 15 weeks. Maybe you couldn't do it in a lifetime. But what we will do today in this lecture is talk about 7 key themes that we often see coming up in the study of Africa. So mostly what I'm talking about here are anthropological studies of Africa, but there are also things here that overlap with geographers or political scientists or historians. So we have um, we have a big task ahead of us here in the next 30 or 40 minutes. And I'm going to try to roll us through this. There's no reading about this. In the past, I've used a textbook that is quite expensive. And honestly, I think you can get a gist of like what are these 7 themes just from me talking today. The first thing, though, that I will say is that in addition to these 7 themes, there are 8 geographic zones that we typically talk about when we're looking at Africa. Um, I want you also to be aware that here on Blackboard, in the little section on that left side that says additional resources, I have included a link to a website that it's like a video game where you can test your geographic knowledge of Africa. It's pretty fun. It asks you to do all 54 countries here on this map, I think in 6 minutes. And I have to tell you, I was rusty. So I did this last night and I actually could not do it in 6 minutes. So it's been a minute. Um, but after I did it once and kind of refreshed my memory with some of the locations of places that I haven't been to or haven't thought about in a while, it came back to me, and I was able to do it in like 4 minutes on the second round. But do do test yourself, and if you do, shoot me an email and let me know what your experience was with that test taking, kind of game situation. Um, Let me see what you think. So let's talk about these regions or zones. Um, you can see there that there are 8. The Maghreb is a region that's here in North Africa. Now, I don't know if you can see my arrow moving. There's no way for me to ask you. So I'm just going to assume that you can see my arrow moving. The Maghreb typically includes, well, Western Sahara is always a little bit controversial, but let's talk about like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, just going across the north. These are nations that border the Mediterranean Ocean. You can see here's the Mediterranean, and you've got like, you can see Spain and Greece and Turkey scooping down. So, um, as the crow flies, Africa is not very far from this region of the world that we know as Europe. And yet, culturally or symbolically, or just in the popular imagination, it seems so much farther. One of the reasons for this is because that Maghreb region is quite distinctly different from this other region that we call sub-Saharan Africa. So that next zone is what we call the Saharan zone, and that is going to include Western Sahara, Mauritania, parts of Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. You know what the Sahara Desert is. It's this enormous desert. I don't think it's the largest in the world. I think the largest desert in the world is the Gobi Desert, and that's in China. Uh, but it's pretty big. And one of the things that the Sahara does is it creates a barrier between all these countries down here, these sub-Saharan African countries, and the Maghreb. And of course, also by extension, Europe. So, back in the day, and even today, crossing the Sahara is no joke. It could take months, even years, to go across the desert. And obviously, you can't go very far at a time. Um, you have to be prepared to endure the deprivations that being in a desert are going to require of you and your travelers. If you're taking pack animals, and of course, camels are probably best known for transporting people across the Sahara Desert. You have to have provisions for your camels. There are cultures that live in the Sahara. Um, the Berber people are probably the best known, and there are others as well. But in terms of cultures, there aren't a ton of cultures in the Sahara. The next zone that we talk about is the Nile Valley. And the Nile Valley runs down Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan. So these are going to be cultures that are really dependent upon the Nile River. And so you probably remember from high school geography that one of the unique features about the Nile River is that it flows from south to north, making it one of the few rivers on the planet that does that. It starts in the highlands and it flows down into the Mediterranean Ocean, Mediterranean Sea. And along its banks, because of its very regular, reliable flooding, uh, massive civilizations were able to grow. So I'm sure you've heard of ancient Egypt. One of the things to think about to put Egypt into perspective is that it wasn't just like a couple of kings and their sons who ran Egypt. It was literally dynasties that lasted for millennia. And altogether, the Egyptian empire kind of rose, peaked, and fell over the course of 4,000 years. So, if you think about the span of time that Egypt was the number one player in town, you get a sense of like what kind of wealth they were able to accumulate and what kind of influence they were able to have on other cultures throughout this region. Pretty remarkable, even today, even by today's standards. The next zone is the Savannah or the Sahel, and that is that region just south of the Sahara Desert. So it doesn't get a ton of rainfall. What we think about with the Savannah, the Sahel, is like a monsoon season. So rather than having regular irrigation or regular rainfall, what would happen is that certain seasons would be characterized by like rain every single day and very heavy rains typically. And so what ends up happening is that the people who live in those regions need to really figure out the natural world so that they can know, when do we plant, when do we harvest, when do we just sit and let the rains fall. I'm partial to the Sahel because I've spent about 6 years of my life living in the Sahel with agricultural people, and the the calendar year has a kind of a rhythm, and of course It's not just the things that people are growing, it's also the animals and the birds and the fish that come at certain times of the year into the rivers and into the landscape. Because the people in the Sahel are going to have migratory birds visiting and going. The next zone that we'll talk about is the West Central Rainforest. And so this really is Cameroon, CAR, DRC, Gabon, Congo, that area. Those, and it's just what it sounds like, a rainforest. Rainforests get very high rates of precipitation. You're talking about every day, year round. Probably also, not surprisingly, the West Central Rainforest is located on the equator. So it's going to be very humid. It's going to be very moist, wet. The other thing about living in a rainforest, and you already know this, even if you don't know you know this, is that because of all the lush vegetation, you typically are talking about like an understory and then also a high, like set of trees that almost block out the sun. People living in rainforests sometimes don't even see the sky because there's so much vegetation above them. So the challenge with that is typically it's hard to grow your own food when you're living in a rainforest. It's not easy to raise vegetables or grains in places that get so much rainfall. Crops would tend to rot. It would be hard to save crops. So in the rainforest, there's a diversity of other kinds of things for people to do. We find a lot of foraging peoples who live in rainforests. Yeah, rainforests aren't great for pastoralists, for people who keep big livestock. Now, a place that is good for people who have big livestock is the Ethiopian highlands. So if we slide over here to the other side of DRC and we look at this zone that runs from like Ethiopia, Uganda, Somalia, Kenya, down into the northern part of Tanzania, you've got highlands. Remember, this is where the Nile River Valley starts. These are the mountains. So there's elevation there, and it's a great place for like just grasslands to be. So if you've heard of the Serengeti, if you've seen those wildlife videos of like people going on safari, this is typically where people go, is to the Ethiopian highlands. Great habitat if you are trying to have lots and lots of livestock, like the Nuer people who we'll talk about this summer, or the Mursi people, Mursi. So these are folks who have, typically cattle, Zebu cattle. They don't drink quite as much water as the cows that we have here in Missouri, and they're, it's a good climate for people who are going to be moving around a little bit. It facilitates and allows for people to be fairly mobile. Okay, the seventh zone is the East Central Great Lakes area, and that's down here, sort of the southern part of Tanzania into Mozambique, including Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. The book that we're going to read this summer, Grains from Grasses, that takes place in the East Central Great Lakes region of Africa. And then we have this region that we call Southern Africa, which includes Angola, Namibia, Botswana, parts of Zimbabwe, and South Africa, with its two included nations, Lesotho and Swaziland. Madagascar, I'm not really sure what to call Madagascar. I'm pretty sure you've seen the film. Madagascar is a very unique place in terms of ecosystem, in terms of vegetation, in terms of wildlife. So we really won't talk a ton about Madagascar this class. I do think we have one article about Madagascar. So there you go. There are the 8 zones. And one of the things to keep in mind is that Africa is an enormous continent. I mean, it's very, very big. Go check it out on Google Maps. Have a look at how big this, span of land is. It's got all different environments, ecosystems, and it also has different types of cultures. I mean, of course it does. So even within the same region, you can have lots of cultural diversity. But when you throw in this context of like these 8 zones that are wildly different from one another, you get a really dynamic space where there is a lot going on. So let's talk about these 7 themes that will keep creeping in over the course of our class this summer. One of the important things that we often talk about when we talk about really any continent, an important piece of understanding how people live inside of an ecosystem is to understand their demography. Demography, you probably know, is the study of human populations. So it's not just how many people live on the continent, but it's also what's the breakdown of the people who live here. How many people over 50? How many people between 35 and 50? How many people, below 15? Demographers are really interested in not only looking at how many people there are, but also how many people there have been, how many people there are going to be, in order to kind of get a handle on trends. We also, when we look at fertility of human populations, are really interested in questions like how is the population replacing itself? In other words, is the population growth high? Are they having lots of babies in every generation? Or is the population growth dropping off? Which is obviously the case in parts of Europe and I think even the United States. If you don't count immigration, the fertility of the United States is actually contracting because people are having fewer children. The magic number here is 1 to 1. So if each person doesn't have at least one child, so, for couples that have just one child, that's going to show a decline in fertility. Or if we have a generation of people who marry and everybody agrees that they want to have 4 children or 6 children, if there's a high value placed on many children, then you're probably going to have rising rates of fertility or rising rates of population. So why do we care about this in anthropology? Well, it turns out that it's important how a culture is managing its population. Whether or not the culture is shrinking or growing has a lot to say about how they are making a living. So, particularly for people who are making a living by growing food, and most of the African continent is doing agricultural subsistence. In an agricultural setting, it's important to have a lot of labor. You could probably think about this, even if you think about like your own parents or maybe your grandparents. If you're from here in Missouri, talk to grandparents who are from Missouri, Kansas, or Indiana, or Illinois. Lots of kids born into those families, right? And we know that the reason that people have a lot of children is because if they're doing agricultural work, they want to have a lot of labor. Another reason that people have a lot of children is because there can sometimes be high rates of infant mortality or child mortality. So that would be typically when we're talking about infant mortality, we're talking about death before the age of 1, so death of babies. And typically when we're talking about child mortality, we're talking about death below the age of 5. And when there are contagious diseases or when there are outbreaks of things, especially diseases that have, things like dehydration, so cholera, things that cause diarrhea, these are going to very quickly harm the little bitty kids because they don't have as much body mass to help them bounce back if they get sick. So, what we typically find is that in places in the world where people are growing their food or where people are raising livestock, they like to have large families. It's an investment in a workforce. Another feature that we often find that accompanies these high rates of fertility is the practice of polygamy. And even more specifically, here, we'll be talking about polygyny. So, especially if you're an anthropology major, you probably have already learned that there are a couple of forms of polygamy, um, which is basically talking about marriage with multiple spouses simultaneously. So if that marriage has multiple wives at the same time, we call that polygyny. And in fact, it turns out that about 80% of the world's cultures are polygynous. It's a good strategy for having lots of babies who are born into every single generation. Because if you think about it, the fertility of each individual woman of our species is limited to a certain number of years, right? Like, what would we say? Let's say conservatively 15 to 40. Now, I know that there's people younger than 15 who have babies, and I know that there's women older who have babies older than 40. But let's just talk like roughly in that area. That's pretty usually what we consider the this span of fertile years in the typical woman's life. Now think about men. Men can have many more children over maybe again starting 15 or younger, but doesn't need to stop at 40. Continue late into a man's life. So just the duration of childbearing is very different for men and women in terms of the years of productivity. And then the other thing, of course, is that when a woman is pregnant, she can really only be pregnant. She can really only have one pregnancy at a time. Now, there might be multiple births happening with that pregnancy, but she can only have one pregnancy at a time. Whereas, play on player, you can have, if you're a man, what's the maximum number of pregnancies that could be involved, you could be involved with? Do we have a number? There is no limit. So just to say that the strategy of having one man with multiple women who are united through marriage, and look, we're going to talk a lot about marriage in this class because African marriages are a big deal and there's a lot to understand about marriage. But in general, we find polygamous societies across Africa, the Maghreb, the Sahara Desert, and sub-Saharan Africa. Another thing that happens when you have cultures that need to have high amounts of labor available is you'll often find enslavement. And in Africa, even until fairly recently, there has been enslavement. Now, look, we're going to talk about this a lot too. In fact, we've got a whole lecture about it. And it's easy to be like, this is an unpleasant thing to talk about, so let's not talk about it. But one of the things that's unique about the kind of slavery that has at least traditionally been practiced in Africa is that it's not a done deal. It's not like you're marked by your skin for the duration of your life, the way we see with like plantation slavery that was practiced in the Western world. Slavery for a lot of African societies included something like you had committed an egregious crime and you agreed to give up your freedom for a certain period of time and work for the person whose lineage you may have harmed. And that was considered a period of enslavement. In other words, it wasn't like born a slave, died a slave. It was freedom is a precious thing and you could do something to lose it. It also includes stuff like during conflict, being taken as a captive of war and forced to perform labor for your captors. Um, so, so there's a couple of different types of slavery that we'll work through, and we'll talk more about. And the other thing to note about fertility is it seems a little bit like, as we go through it, oh, people are valuing families so much, and everybody's involved with growing food, and of course that's overly simplistic. There are some men in a lot of polygynous systems. There are some men who never have the capacity to take a wife, because there are other men who monopolize the wives. And so we will see that there's frequently conflict between men or between groups of men about the issue of marriage and about the issue of access to resources. And of course, that's not just true in Africa, that's true everywhere. Marriage often operates as an alliance. So that, if you're familiar with any of those BBC dramas that talk about the marriage of the Habsburgs, or the Holy Roman Emperor getting married to his sister or whatever, alliances build political systems, and alliances can be really important economic resources. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Anyway, these are themes that are going to come up this term while we talk about African cultures. Well, here's a picture from Rwanda, and these are farmers. You can see it's mostly men here, but there's a few women there. One of the things that it's important to think of when you think about Africa and the African continent, and a woman named Esther Boserup, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, said this. When you're talking about Africa, it is just as accurate to say the farmer and her husband as it is to say the farmer and his wife, because women do an enormous amount of agricultural labor on the African continent. And we'll talk about reasons why that is too when we talk about gender. But essentially, what that means is that women are a very productive part of a workforce. And that also means when women are productive members of an economic system, that they tend to be valued fairly highly. So when we talk about those marriages as alliances, we'll also talk about some of these cultural factors that accompany marriage, like bride wealth and bride service, that are really important to maintaining the economic integrity of a household of people who are connected to each other, and they're also connected to the land. Another reason that I put this slide in here is like, these folks are growing tea. Holy cats, friends. Do you think that these folks are drinking all this damn tea? I mean, how much kombucha can you make? They're selling this tea. And so we'll also talk a little bit in class about the distinction between what we might call a subsistence crop that you grow to eat, and also a cash crop, which is a crop that you grow to sell. And typically cash crops start getting introduced to Africa right around World War II, maybe a little bit prior to that. And they have fundamentally transformed the cultures in exactly the same way that capitalism transformed Western culture. We start to see these kinds of transformations happening as people get hooked into a global political economy where they're selling commodities on a global market, and they start to lose control of their economic well-being to a large degree. Another theme that we'll be talking about has to do with, how do people govern themselves? How is the political system organized? And an important thing to think about that is that there are very frequently in Africa ruling elites. Many of the African societies that we'll be mentioning have hierarchical internal structures. And if you're familiar with India and you've ever heard of the caste system, this is a little bit similar. There are parts of Africa, specifically when we talk about the Sunjata book, where the society is organized by occupational castes, which is to say that different people have different kinds of jobs and they also have different kinds of prestige associated with those jobs. And so you have a difference in means and access and resources and power and influence according to the lineage that you belong to, the family that you are part of. The other thing that we see happening with these systems of government is that there are these ruling elites. Those distinctions are frequently made according to kinship, or in Africa, we often use this term segmentary lineage or segmentation. So, again, we'll talk more about this when we talk about kinship, but uh, some families pass down titles and inheritances, and other lineages do not. So, there's frequently a system in place known as patron and client relations, where there could be one lineage that has another lineage that they are paired, and one lineage does a certain kind of labor and another lineage does a different kind of labor, and they work together to share those resources. um, so for example, again, in West Africa, among the Mande people, there's a group of people who are known as the Jelia, and these are praise singers. They are connected to lineages known as the Horal, and those are the people who are like the elites, like the leaders. The Horal and the Jelia are frequently associated with one another, but check it out, they don't intermarry. It's complicated. African kinship is very complicated. We can also talk about autochthony or localism, which is to say that autochthony is when a group of people are from the place where they're living and they haven't, at least as far as we can tell in their archaeological record, they haven't moved very much. Um, Now, obviously, everybody in Africa has moved at some point. So, what we mean by autochthonous is really a question of how far back do you want to go. But there are people who have been occupying land, and that, that's going to include mountains and rivers and fields and sacred spaces for thousands and thousands of years. That's autochthonous governance. Like, people want to stay in their place. They will fight to stay in their place. They will die to stay in their place. So there can be conflict. There has been conflict. Um, and we'll talk about some of the sad consequences of some of that conflict when we talk about the Rwandan genocide. Oh, here's some ancient African empires, and you can see, I think I've mentioned this to you before, you probably haven't heard about all of this stuff because we don't really teach it in American schools. You can see up there in the Maghreb that Egypt was carrying on and going crazy. But have you heard of the Kingdom of Aksum or any of these big Bantu states? I've got a video for you to watch on Great Zimbabwe. And then this first book that we're going to read, we'll be talking about the West African imperialist system. In particular, we'll be talking about the Ghana Empire. I'm sorry, the Mali Empire. Lots of governance, lots of political systems, big, enormous imperial systems that rose and fell while Europe was still in the Dark Ages, essentially. Okay, a third theme that we often talk about when we talk about African studies or the anthropology of Africa is the idea of identity. There's lots of different ways that you can get your identity. We can be talking about local identities. So those would be kin-based. This is getting back a little bit to that autochthonous stuff. Sometimes it's place-based. Local identities are typically ethnic, which is to say that people are related to each other through their history, their lineages, and also typically through language. They're typically going to be practicing the same or at least a very similar religion. They're probably going to be intermarrying. There's also regional identities. Like you can go and you can talk to somebody who's Tanzanian. Of course, there's 26 ethnic groups in Tanzania. So um, one of the real magical things about Tanzania is that they had a president whose name was Julius Nyerere, who became president in the 1960s when Africa was having this huge um, rise in Pan Africanism and they're splitting off from Europe. And Nyerere was really serious about having this regional identity. And so what he did was he united his country, Tanzania, and he made everybody, well, he didn't make them. He said Swahili was the official language. Now think about what you know about Africa. A lot of African countries that were colonized took the colonial language, right? If you think about like French being spoken in parts of West Africa, or English being spoken in parts of West Africa, like Nigeria is English speaking. Nyerere was like, no, I want to create an African nation. And so he united these ethnicities. And one of the things that's interesting about Tanzania is that it has very little ethnic violence. Tanzanians are incredibly proud of that. Then of course there's also like an African identity, like this, and then this is going to include like Africa and the diaspora. The whole idea of being like a Pan-Africanist, like to say Pan-Africanist to be like anyone who comes from the continent of Africa, which frankly is to say all of us because life began on the African continent. But more specifically, what we take this to mean is, people who have Black skin, people who've had these experiences of oppression, particularly in the colonial era, um, are part of this Pan-Africanist movement. Look, there's lots to talk about with Pan-Africanism. A few things that I'll mention here is Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican writer, scholar. He coins the term Pan-Africanism, and it just becomes this huge thing that people are into in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and then it starts to die out. And in the last week of our class, we'll talk about this more. There's been a real resurgence of Pan-Africanism. We'll talk about some of that why. A fourth theme that I was just mentioning is the idea of continuity and rapid change. I mean, one of the things that you can definitely say about Africa is that it is not the same place that it was 100 years ago. I mean, to be fair, neither is America. But when you're talking about like from one generation to the next, people going from being like maybe not knowing that there were continents off, outside of their continent, to all of a sudden like being able to like hold an iPhone and talk to people on other continents. That period of change has happened fairly quickly. Um, Colonialism on the continent really dates back to the 1300s. I mean, nearly a millennium of colonialism. But the colonialism that we are really seeking to understand in this class uh, intensified between the 18th through today, 18th century through today, where we did have a lot of extractive colonialism and also this um, introduction of what we call plantation slavery, which really changes the game in terms of enslavement for a number of reasons, but mostly because of the way that it marks human beings into categories, and this creation of this notion of race that rises up during this period of time. We'll talk about this more too. So a fifth theme that we often look at is the idea about art and material culture. And art is going to include music, it's going to include dance. So there's a big thing going on right now. There are these bronze statues from Benin that were taken out of Benin in the early 1900s, and they've been at the British Museum. And the people of Benin want them back. No joke. So there's been a huge amount of controversy and horse trading and um, efforts to withhold those bronzes, to return those bronzes. It's a whole thing. A guy called Dan Hicks has a book about it. But if you just Google Benin bronzes, if this is something you're interested in, you'll find a lot. One of the things to think about when we think about art is that, art is symbolic, and it also um, frequently embodies notions of spirituality or supernatural. So when we talk about art from Africa, a lot of times what we're talking about are objects that are imbued with particular significance by the cultures that have created them. So I'm talking things like masks or certain kinds of um, pendants, jewelry. Um, and again, we'll see some examples of this, but most cultures have art, and that art is very frequently charged with a kind of a symbolic energy. In Oceania, we call this quality mana. It's this idea of reverence or awe or something that transports something ordinary into something extraordinary that can rally people around it. We'll spend more time talking about that too. A sixth theme that we see in our course is this idea about about trade. One of the big important trade items or trade routes included enslavement. This went off of both coasts, so that we had people being kidnapped essentially and transported against their will off the west coast of Africa into what we call the triangle trade. But also East Africa had an enormous slave trade that went to India and the Middle East. And a lot of that is facilitated by trade routes that were opened up by Muslim traders beginning in about the 10th century. So I think, do I have a map? No, I don't have a map here, but I will get you a map that shows how Islam penetrated the continent. And we have a whole lecture where we'll talk about the influences of Islam on African cultures. One of the things to think about with trade, though, is that when new commodities are introduced, how does that transform the ideas of the people who are receiving those commodities? Similarly, if people are being asked to export things, how does the meaning of those objects transform for them? And how do trade routes or trade relationships influence the balance of power among people who live locally? Does it tend to exacerbate social difference? Is there a way that trade can have equalizing effect? And the answer is yes to both. So we'll talk more about that. An important thing too to remember is that once Africans are introduced to Islam, very many people convert. You've got lots of parts of Africa that are profoundly influenced by Islam, going back 1,000 years. And one of the things that's significant about that is that pious Muslims like to have the opportunity to perform the pilgrimage to Mecca. So you've got regular people leaving the continent, going on pilgrimage, and that has transformative effects as well. We've got an article called Al Haji Airplane about a guy from West Africa who goes to Mecca. That's kind of a fun article. And, for my dissertation, I interviewed a lot of religious pilgrims, and it really does transform how people think about the world. So again, I'm probably not doing this topic justice, but these themes, and within each of these themes there's other tensions at play. We already saw it when we were talking about art and material culture, but again with trade, there's a tension between like the ideal world, the ideas, languages, religious notions, the kind of stuff that Weber talks about, the ideology of culture. And then there's also this other world that anthropologists like to talk about that has to do with like the architecture and the wealth and the material culture, the kinds of things that Marx was interested in. So it's a real tension. It's a binary. It's probably an unnecessary binary. We'll talk about this more in theory. If you stick around and major in anthropology, we get a lot of discussion about that in the theory class. And then finally, the seventh theme that we will be exploring, and particularly in the latter half of the class, is what's the relationship of Africa to the rest of the world? In a lot of ways, Africa's history has enabled the history of other places. I mean, particularly if you think about all the wealth that has been stolen off of the continent of Africa, not only a couple of hundred years ago, but today. People are still extracting wealth from Africa. That all these this natural resources. If you have your magic space phone, there's stuff in here, coltan, a mineral called coltan, Coltan, that comes from Central Africa, that is used in cell phones. And when we go in and we take that stuff off of the continent, that there are people living there, and this material imperialism to extract, that's part of the capitalist system, has impacted Africa profoundly. There's a period of history called the Scramble for Africa. You probably know about that from history class in high school, where basically European nations just sat down with a map and they were like, okay, this is for you and this is for us. And then there's also this kind of idea, like, for souls, the missionary activity that's going on, people going to Africa to convert, to gain souls. And then also, Africa really did benefit from a lot of new crops being introduced, including things like nuts and corn and cassava. Those were introduced from the Americas. Today, a lot of companies, entrepreneurs, startups are very interested in Africa as a new market. It's the fastest growing part of the world. Lots of customers to be had on the continent. So there's a lot of interest in Africa and how Africa interacts with the rest of the world. I think I've already mentioned to you several times that I lived in West Africa for the most part. And if you can see my pointer here, I lived here in the western part of Mali, over by the Senegalese border. And then when I did my doctoral research, I lived down here in Guinea, like right around where the letter E is in the word Guinea. And so this region is known as the Mande region. Really, it's quite a big region, and it corresponds pretty nicely to what used to be called the Mali Empire. So you find people there speaking a similar language, having similar cultural features, and having a lot, intermarrying and having a lot of common features in their day-to-day lives in terms of like what they like to eat and the music that they play and the stories that they tell and the hero that they have. And of course, the hero that we're going to be talking about is this guy Sunjata. So I'm not sure if it's the next lecture you'll listen to, but a couple lectures from now, you're going to be listening to a lecture where I talk to you about the kingdom of Mande, the kingdom of Mali, which was united under this guy Sunjata Keita. And you have a book to read called Sunjata. And so that's where I'll leave this. And we'll talk more about that next time. Thanks, friends.